All right. So we are still kind of going through the background. We have two, I think, maybe three more things that we need to cover before we actually get into reading the text. So there are, like we talked about, there are unique aspects of John that are flowing throughout the narrative that I want us to identify early so that you can see when they pop up throughout the text. I think we talked about all of these. I think we talked about irony, so we should be good to move forward. But when we do get to the text, keep these things in mind of looking at insiders and outsiders, who is in and who is out, and what's the terminology John uses to describe them. What about ascending and descending? Who's coming down and who's going up, and why does this matter? Um, when we're talking about seeing and believing, one thing that we didn't really talk about was see if I can get it to underline, was the idea of a witness or a testimony. This is very important in John, and it pops up a lot. Even in the beginning, in the prologue, kind of the poem about the word, he talks about John the Baptist. He does not call him John the Baptist. He's identified as John the Witness. He's John, the one who testifies about Jesus. Testimony is an important recurring idea. And eventually you're going to see Jesus claiming, no one can say that I'm wrong about the things I'm saying about God because I am the only one who's ever seen God. I am the only one who knows what's going on in heaven because some people have died and gone to heaven. I'm the only one who's come from heaven to live. And that, according to Jesus, makes his testimony unique. And that's something that we just have to pick up on to see how he traces that through. Okay. I think a lot of us are familiar with this on some level. This idea of these I am statements and Jesus being repeatedly saying these sort of things. Maybe we put too much stock in them. Maybe we don't. I don't know. We talked at the end of last time about the soldiers coming to arrest Jesus and Jesus saying, I am, and all of them falling over and it being really funny. I don't know that this has the same intention as that story. You know, when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, it's important. He's making a big claim, but I don't know if he's saying, I don't know if he's using the divine name when he's saying these things. He might just be using normal Greek to say, I am this thing, using this metaphor. But we are going to talk about, I think, all of these as we go through the text because they add a lot of character and they add a lot of nuance to the way that Jesus is presenting himself. And the metaphors don't always stick. If you look at, man, my cursor's not working for my pen. If you look at these two in the middle, I am the gate for the sheep. And then he starts talking about anybody who comes in by a way other than the gate is a thief and a robber. But then he turns around in 3 verses and says, I am the shepherd. He goes very quickly, kind of using the same metaphor from being the gate to get into the sheep to the shepherd who takes care of the sheep. It's an odd kind of mixed metaphor that changes very quickly and doesn't explain why it's changing. And these are just things that we kind of have to deal with in the way that the text moves. But starting in chapter 6, we'll look at how he's using these words, how he's using these phrases, and what he might actually mean by them. Good? Okay. One of the big things that we need to talk about is John's use of this term, which I have left untranslated because we always have trouble figuring out what it means. We normally, your text probably translates it loosely as the Jews. Judaioi is the word. And it is difficult to understand. If you recall from, what day is today? Tuesday. The way that John speaks about the Jews is problematic. And particularly given like Christian history of Christian Jewish relations and the terrible things Christians have done to Jews for the last 2,000 years. 1,700 years, ever since we got power. It has been problematic. And these texts have been part of the issue. If you recall, we talked about this briefly in Matthew. When Jesus is on trial and Pilate washes his hands, Matthew tells us that the crowd, together in one voice, cried out, "His blood be on us and on our children." And that claim was used throughout church history to say all Jews for all time are guilty, morally, of killing God. Therefore, their lives are forfeit, and you can do whatever you want to them. These texts in John further emphasize, or have been used by the church to further emphasize, the depravity of the Jews. Not just the religious leaders in Jesus's time, but your Jewish neighbor down the street also falls into these categories. So in the last 100 years, particularly obviously after the Holocaust, scholars have really tried to look at these texts to figure out, is that really what the text means? And if not, how can we talk about the text in a way that's more accurate to what the text means and less harmful for Christian-Jewish relations? There have been a lot of attempts to figure out how to do this. This has always been translated as just the Jews. But when you use it as a blanket statement like this, it becomes very problematic. This was kind of beaten into my brain as a master's student, where if I'm reading someone's paper, or if I'm looking at something or listening to a sermon, my little Vandy ears tingle when somebody uses the Jews just as a collective without any sort of descriptive or qualifier or anything. When I'm writing, I don't think you'll ever see me use a term that's just a blanket term like this. I will always have some sort of qualifier where I will say the religious leaders or Jesus's Jewish interlocutor, right? The Jewish person that he's talking to. Because when you use a blanket term like this, church history has grabbed onto that to say, oh, it applies to your neighbor down the street. And I think it's our responsibility to try to figure out ways around that. Try to figure out ways where we can be more clear with who we're actually talking about. In an effort to do that, some people have taken this term and translated as Judeans, which is probably helpful because Judeans, particularly in John, are those Jews in Judea who are closely connected to the temple and its system. And John is critical of the temple and its system. So maybe the Judean Jews are what's in mind, as opposed to Jesus's followers or as opposed to the Galileans. But translating the word this way doesn't work 100% of the time. There are some times where like Jesus is in Galilee talking to Jews and the word used is Judaioi. And so Judeans might not really fit in that context. And so people have tried to figure out different ways for us to translate it. Maybe you could be more clear and just use this idea of Jewish leaders. That's who Jesus's opponents are. If you look at the crowds, they're very fickle. You see this particularly in John. But all the Gospels highlight this. If you compare the crowd's response at Palm Sunday, right, the triumphal entry, to the crowd's response at Jesus' trial, it's the same crowd. It's the same people, but they've been whipped up into a different mindset. John would say they've been whipped up into a different mindset by these leaders. Not that the Jews are evil and are trying to kill God, that the Jewish leaders are evil and trying to kill God. And that's different. Maybe if you read it this way, you think of the leaders as the wolves, or the blind leading the blind, or the false prophets that John talks about. And the normal Jewish countrymen, the normal people, are not opponents of Jesus, they're victims of the leadership, and they need a better leader. That's a more charitable way to read it, probably. Some go on to say Eudaioi here, maybe not a good way to translate it, but really what it represents is essentially anybody that's in the world that's not a follower of Jesus. So anytime the term is used, it is not specific to ethnic Jews. It is anyone who's on the outside. Anyone who doesn't follow Jesus is worldly and in the darkness and doesn't understand. And maybe that's a better category to understand what Jesus is talking about here. If you look at all these texts, the Eudaioi, whoever they are, the Judeans, the Jerusalem leaders, they are full of problems. They resist Jesus' teachings. They don't understand God. They don't believe. They can't read scripture for themselves. They don't love God. They don't follow the law. And this is kind of, I think we talked about this on Tuesday. They claim Abraham as their father. They claim God as their father. But Jesus says, no, because of your actions, I know the devil is your father. Because you're trying to murder me and you're lying about me. And the devil is the father of all murder and lies, because he was lying and murdering from the beginning. You see the connection here. Now, later Christians will come along and say, no, Jesus meant it. The Jews now are ethnically descended from Satan. Their blood is impure because of Satan, their connections to Satan. And this goes really far. In the Middle Ages, and even, in the last 100 years, there's this idea of blood libel. Have you guys heard this? It's essentially a myth that says that those Jews who live outside our village on Shabbat or on Passover come and kidnap Christian children, drain them of their blood, and sacrifice them to the devil. And so this has never happened in 2,000 years of history, but at least, that we can prove. But it is a pervasive myth. Essentially, anytime a kid goes missing, they can blame the Jews for kidnapping the kid and sacrificing him to Molech or Baal or whoever it is, right? And this doesn't come out of nowhere. I think a lot of us look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous, right? That's a crazy thing to believe. But what I'm trying to point out is it comes from our text. So we are responsible for addressing it and interpreting and discussing our text well, so that people who hear us talking don't come away with the same ideas. Good on this? Go ahead, Carlos. One thing that I want to leave with while we're still on this, a lot of the accusation against John now is that John is anti-Semitic. But this is a very loaded term that is particularly influenced. It's in our minds as a racial term. But this as a racial term doesn't make sense to anybody prior to the 18th century. The idea of race is relatively new in collective human history. It's probably more accurate to say that John is anti-Jewish, in the sense of, if you convert from Judaism to Christianity, or to use their terms, if you accept that Jesus is who he says he is, if you follow him as the Messiah, then none of this applies to you. You are no longer Eudaioi. You are no longer any of these things because you've converted, right? Later, in church history, this is the mindset. So in the Crusades, Christians will come along and murder Jews. They just do. But the Jews could convert. If they come along and say, I want to become a Christian, then they don't get killed. They are accepted as Christian. In the 20th century, that is not an option. With we talked about the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, that is not an option. You are ethnically tied to Judaism because it's in your blood. You are Jewish if one of your 4 grandparents are Jewish. And it doesn't matter what you believe theologically, you are out. So there is really a distinction between these two things. But my point is the anti-Semitism that we see in the 20th century does not come out of nowhere. Hitler does not invent anti-Semitism, right? It comes from Luther, right? Luther is the main guy who establishes German identity as German Protestant Christian. And Luther, by the end of his life, is very anti-Jewish and maybe a little anti-Semitic, the way that we would describe it. And Hitler can come along and pick up on this. Germans outside of Hitler can come along and pick up on this. But for Luther, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a long history of reading and interpreting these texts. Yes, we are all very aware that Jesus is Jewish. But think of I think all of us know the super woke people who complain about the white Jesus. You know what I mean? People complain about this a lot. It's a very legitimate critique, though, because when you have a very white Jesus with blonde hippie surfer hair who looks like Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's not Jewish. He doesn't look Jewish. And when you have that in your mind, and then you read texts like this, you have a Christianity that is, you have a Jesus who's completely separated from Judaism. And that is not historical at all. So we just have to have these things in mind when we're reading these texts and figure out how to articulate them well. Okay, we'll keep going because we still haven't actually gotten into the text. There's one more thing to talk about. And if the stuff about Eudioi pops up during the text, we'll get into it again, I'm sure. Another aspect of John's gospel that's unique. Jesus' ministry is fundamentally different than what we see in the synoptics. And there's two pillars of this. One, in the synoptics, Jesus teaches in parables. And in John, he never does. So if you're telling me about the unique parts of John's gospel in your final essay, please do not tell me about John having Jesus teach in parables. He doesn't. There is no parable in the Gospel of John. There's just not. That's not how Jesus operates in the story. The other thing is, in the Gospels, in the Synoptics, Jesus just runs around performing miracles all the time. And they are called miracles. In John, that is not the case. Although John does say that Jesus is doing other things that he's not writing about, John limits himself. He does not call them miracles. He calls them signs, and he specifically numbers 7 of them. Some scholars will argue that there's probably an 8th one, which is his own resurrection, right? 8 being the idea of a new creation, a new birth, a new, right? It's the first day of a new week. This is important that John structures his gospel this way. In the first 12 chapters, John is intent on describing Jesus as the Son of God. And by that, he means the revelation that God has sent to humanity. Okay? And being a believer or not depends entirely on whether you accept Jesus's claims about himself. Jesus is going to come and tell him who he is. And if you accept his claims, then you are considered a believer and you are given eternal life. It doesn't have anything to do with the cross. It doesn't have anything to do with dying and going to heaven. In the moment that you accept who Jesus is, who he says he is, you receive something different, what Jesus would call a new birth. Okay? The signs here all point to Jesus' glory as the revelation of God. They are not displays of power for power's sake. They are not a cheap party trick. Although John does tell us Jesus is doing other signs, he only tells us about these 7 and connects them specifically with displays of who Jesus really is. So when you see John say this was the first sign that Jesus performed, it's almost always connected with some revelation, right? When he turns water into wine at the wedding at Cana, the text tells us the disciples knew that he did this, right? The wedding guests didn't know, but the disciples knew. And this display of power is what makes the disciples believe. Now they believe that he is who he says he is. These are the sort of things that we trace through to figure out what's going on. By the end of chapter 11, Jesus wraps up his ministry. He is done with these external displays of power to identify who he is. He has gathered together the people that he wants and the people that haven't left. And in chapter 12, the story shifts from these external displays of power where Jesus is trying to convince you who he is to an internal teaching to only his disciples, preparing them for what's going to happen. There's no more signs. There's no more displays of power. And the revelation is not connected to miracle working. It's connected to Jesus' teaching. Good on this? If you take away anything about like the structure of John, I think we talked briefly about the book of signs, and then chapter 12 is kind of in the middle, and then we call it the book of glory. Okay, this is why all the signs here happen between chapters 2 and 11, because this is what we call the book of signs. And then the book of glory is 1, Jesus preparing his disciples for his crucifixion, and 2, Jesus actually being crucified. The display of his glory through his teaching and through his crucifixion. Good on this? Julian, good question. There is a sharp distinction between the synoptics and John. The book that I referenced when we were talking about that weeks ago about, don't just look at a miracle and assume it means that Jesus is God. That was a man attested by God. It's by Kirk. That is specifically about the synoptics. And he is arguing in Mark, when Jesus walks on water, other people can walk on water too. So it doesn't mean that Jesus is God. In Luke, when people are raising people when Jesus raises the little girl from the dead, it does not mean that Jesus is God necessarily, because Peter also can raise people from the dead, right? That other disciples can do the same things that Jesus can do, or other people in Jewish history receive the same titles that Jesus does, right? Moses is called a son of God. Daniel talks about a son of man, and they're not necessarily divine connections. Even Kirk in that book admits, I think right at the beginning, this cannot apply to the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John is explicit that Jesus is God. There is no way to read the Gospel of John without interpreting it that way. That John, from the beginning and throughout, is identifying Jesus as co-equal with God, co-eternal with God. John says that Jesus shares the same glory as the Father. He says, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. I and the Father are one. It goes on and on. It has all of these texts. It is explicit. And I think that is part of why John uses this terminology, assuming John knows about the other Gospels. Maybe he knows Jesus is running around performing miracles all the time in the synoptics. But John is saying, okay, but I want to emphasize these specific ones because I can connect these stories of him performing this miracle to a specific revelation of who Jesus is, right? It's not just that Jesus can turn water into wine. Who cares? It's that symbolically, Jesus is making something new, right? Maybe that's what John is trying to get at by using the terminology. The miracles are not just displays of power. If they were, they would just be called miracles. In John, They're called signs because they signify something else. The display of power is only there to point to something greater, which is Jesus' self-revelation. Him claiming to be God wrapped in flesh, walking around and talking to us. And that is different than anything you see in the synoptics. I mean, it just really is. I'm not saying Mark doesn't believe Jesus is God. I think he does. But the way that John presents it is fundamentally different than anything you see in the synoptics. Good? Okay.